You're listening to the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, your escape to reality.
Hello and welcome to the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. Today is Wednesday, July 7th, 2021, and this is your host, Stephen Novella. Joining me this week are Bob Novella.
Hey, everybody.
Kara Santamaria.
Howdy.
And Evan Bernstein.
Good evening, everyone.
Jay is chilling in Hawaii right now on vacation, so
What an asshole.
he'll try to join us. I don't know if he was serious. He was like, yeah, I'll try to join you guys on Wednesday from Hawaii. But
yeah.
I don't know if I'm going to be able to get enough Wi-Fi from the hotel room or whatever. Okay. I'm sure he's on a beach somewhere.
I know. I'm like, please, there's plenty of Wi-Fi in Hawaiian hotel rooms.
But I was in Hawaii not that long ago, on the island of Oahu, and like there's this whole chunk of the island with no internet, like none. They don't have internet.
Is that for real?
So it's
weird.
Wow.
I don't think that's where they're staying. I'm just saying.
Going native.
All right, we have to introduce a service to that part of the state and call it Hawaii-Fi. I already got the marketing plan down, so that part is taken care of. Now you just have to build it. I did the hard
name.
part.
That's the important part.
Absolutely.
So what'd you guys do over the weekend, July 4th?
It was my birthday.
Happy birthday, Bob.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
And I
How'd
saw you on your birthday.
Usual. We had a 4th of July birthday cookout barbecue pool scenario.
The actual people without masks.
Actual people without
nice.
masks. And it wasn't that many. What did we have? 16 to 18 people. Yeah, we were all vaccinated. And so it was great to get together and in a way that we hadn't been able to do for quite a while. So it was a lot of fun. Plus, of course, I had to decorate my 12-foot skeleton.
Oh, yeah.
That was an awesome little project.
And you had some peanut butter themed birthday cake, of course.
Yes. Oh boy. I was eating that for 3 days.
It's remarkable that people over the course of about 20 months in some cases, I had not seen some of those folks until your birthday party, Bob. And just catching up with them after not seeing them for so long. It's one thing to catch up on social media and so forth, but it's just another thing to be in person, face to face with those people and have more of a dynamic, fluid conversation with them. It's just a totally different experience for me.
Yeah.
And so was that on July 4th proper?
Yes,
Yeah.
proper.
So
Right,
what's
proper.
it like where you guys live? Because I live in Los Angeles, right? The second largest city in the United States. And when the 4th of July is like we're under attack. Like I didn't do much because most of my friends were out of town. They had gone on camping trips and things like that. And I needed to stay back and work on my qualifying examinations and my dissertation proposal. And so I kind of worked through the weekend, used that extra time to my advantage. And then on the 4th proper, my neighbor and I, because neither of us had plans, we, grilled on his roof and hung out with the puppies. And you could just sit and watch fireworks from the roof because we live in these small lot houses. So there's a roof deck. Every person who lives in LA has the same experience, which is nonstop fireworks literally all night. And so there's a constant barrage of people complaining that their dogs are freaking out. There's always a lot of kind of warnings about wildfires because there's just so much illegal firework activity. It's just such a part of the culture here. It really bums me out because it's always happening during the driest, most dangerous time to be lighting off fires.
Yeah, I was listening to a report that like if you track the fire season in the West, it's basically July 4th. That's when
July 4th is the worst.
You get this sharp uptick in wildfires. It's all fireworks.
Yeah, it's really terrible. But it's also kind of like just a surreal experience. I'm very lucky that my dog doesn't spook from fireworks at all, so it's easy to just hang with Killer and he's like, whatever, I don't care. But you could sit out for 3 hours and you'd have a light show the whole time.
Wow. Connecticut's like if you want to find fireworks, you could find them. They're not hard. But if you want to get away from them, it's not a problem either.
Oh, interesting. So I came across this news article and a lot of different people are covering it. This one was from NPR. And I was like, why is nobody talking about this? There were over 540 shootings in the U.S. over July 4th weekend. And 516 people were injured. 189 people were killed.
Oh, my goodness.
I know. And I don't know if that's, just a cross section of what shootings are like, because we often talk about mass shootings and they happen less frequently, even though sometimes it's like one a day in this country. But we often don't talk about a shooting where only one person is injured or two people are injured. And I don't know if this is just a function of, aggregation, or if the 4th, because it's warm outside, because it's summer, because maybe there's coverage because of the pops from the fireworks, that it might be easier to get away with a shooting, or because, the cops are tied up. But for whatever reason, that's a bananas number, and I barely saw any reporting on it.
Yeah, I haven't seen
I didn't see much either.
But I know
isn't that nuts?
Overall violent crime is up this year. I don't know if that's pent up crime from last year because it took a big dip during the pandemic, or I haven't heard a really good explanation for it.
Right. I think it happens every year, but yeah, it was worse this year. You're right. So there is a clustering around this time each year, but it's gotten worse. And so I think there's a lot more, there are more guns on the street. I'm seeing all sorts of different types of explanations for it, but I think it's probably not one variable. It's probably many, many variables around the pandemic, around, economic difficulties, around all these different things that usually feed into this problem. But goodness, those numbers they gobsmacked me. And I was like, are we this numb that it doesn't even really make a blip in the headlines? Wow.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Totally
I know, because it's so typical here. Yikes.
All right. Well, despite the absence of Jay, we actually have a very full show this week. So why don't we get started? Carrie, you're going to give us a what's the word?
Yes. All right. So I was just digging around interwebs to try and find something that I hadn't covered before. And I came across this word, osculant. And the reason it spoke to me is because I was like, I've literally never seen this word before. I've never used it. I've never seen it. And there are lots of variations of osculant. There's oscular. There's osculating. And so osculant was the one that I saw most tied to a science definition. But if you dig into the etymology of this and you dig into the overt definitions, they will almost always come up having to do with kissing or embracing. And so it's interesting. I want to start there. To osculate is a word that comes from a Latin root, osculatus or osculari, that means to kiss. So, and also some weird things like mouth. It comes from mouth, like oral, some of the same roots there. But to kiss one another is to osculate, and and osculation then would be the noun form of kissing. The reason that this has a scientific definition is, I found two different scientific definitions. One has to do with evolutionary biology. So an osculant or osculate is to be intermediate between two taxonomic groups. So like these two different species osculate, meaning that they're sort of in between taxonomic groups. So I like to think of maybe like transitional fossils or individual organisms that are kind of hard to place. So, and sometimes you'll see different definitions that say that they might be intermediate between two genera or two families, like they have some of the characteristics of each. Another word that means the same thing would be interosculant. So those, that's an interosculant species, for example. In zoology, you'll see the word, and this speaks more to the root definition, adhering closely. So you'll actually see like caterpillars. They adhere closely to the branch. They like creep really close to their substrate. And so they are osculant creatures. I love that. And then you also see it in mathematics. And the best definition I could find, I found one, first of all, that I was like, what? I found one definition of an osculating circle. A circle which is tangent to a curve at a given point, which lies in the limiting plane, determined by the tangent to the curve and a point moving along the curve to the point of tangency, which has its center situated on the normal to the curve at the given point, and also on the concave side of the projection of the curve onto the limiting plane, and which has a radius equal to the radius of curvature. But
explains everything.
Sure. But then I found another definition that made a little bit more sense to me, and that was to have at least 3 points in common with. So when we're talking about a curve, two surfaces might osculate if at least 3 of their points on the curve. So 2 points, right, is linear. But once we get to 3, that becomes an osculate curve or osculate surfaces. So they have multiple points in common on the curve.
I see.
Yeah, and so it all comes down to this like kissing root. these things kiss, they're very close. You might even see it used as embracing. So, of course, this has like a beautiful literary definition. It's a word that we could all be using more in our vocabulary because osculant, I don't know, it's just such a pretty word to osculate, osculation, osculent, which is, of course, the adjective.
Osculicious?
Osculicious, sure, why not, right? The English language is flexible and always evolving. But yeah, the fact that you will come across this in the literature when talking about intermediate species that don't easily fit into one of two taxonomic groups. And it has that same root, which I think is quite lovely.
Neat. Yeah, it's a fun word. I've also never used it before.
Yeah, it was weird.
I can't think of any medical application.
Even though you would think it would have a ton of medical applications, but probably it would feel a little bit esoteric because there are other words that are already used that mean the same thing.
Yeah. All right, thanks, Kara. Mm-hmm. All right, I'm going to start off the news items. Have you guys heard about the hubbub surrounding the FDA's approval of a new Alzheimer's medication?
Yes.
Yes. Didn't some people resign over this?
Yes, they did.
Wow.
But I'll tell you about that in a second. So the medication is Aducanumab,
which sounds like a cancer drug.
Well, here's why. Yeah, the MAB at the end means it's a monoclonal antibody. So there's a lot of monoclonal antibody treatments for cancer now, which is why you might make that link. But there's also a lot of monoclonal antibody medications for autoimmune diseases. And there's a new group of monoclonal antibody medications for migraines. So monoclonal antibodies are taking off. Yeah, so it's one of those things, again, like I first heard about them in the 1990s, and then here we are 25 years later, and we're really starting to see all of these clinical applications. That's the delay that we typically see.
Yikes, whole generation.
From basic science to, the real heyday of clinical applications.
Yeah.
So in any case, there is a drug called Aducanumab, which was just approved for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease. Now, you might think that's a great thing. The only drugs we have so far for Alzheimer's are considered symptomatic. They reduce the symptoms of the dementia. They might, improve your memory a little bit, but they're not disease modifying, right? They don't cure the disease. They don't slow down the disease or prevent it from progressing.
And the one that most people think of, right, is Aricept. That's the
Aricept, which is purely symptomatic. Mm-hmm. Yeah, purely symptomatic. Absolutely. So this is the first one approved that is addressing the underlying pathophysiology of the disease. One of the things that happens in Alzheimer's disease, which again, it's a neurodegenerative disease which affects the brain and causes dementia, progressive loss of memory, and pretty much eventually all cognitive function, right?
It's awful.
Yeah, people usually survive from 3 to 11 years following their diagnosis. Obviously, that depends on how long they waited until they got diagnosed, how old they were at the onset, and also the rapidity of the progression. So there's a lot of variables there. In the U.S., the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease is 9.7% in those 70 years and older.
And then it goes
up
the older you get.
It goes up until 85. Up until 85.
Okay.
It pretty much
plateaus.
And then it levels off.
Significantly increases. The monoclonal antibody is targeted towards the amyloid beta plaque, right? So that's this abnormally folded protein which builds up in brain cells in patients with Alzheimer's disease. This is the focus of the controversy as well, because the FDA fast-tracked the drug for approval based upon 2 trials that did not look at clinical outcome. They only looked at the reduction in the amyloid beta plaque, which is considered a biomarker, right? Now, we've talked about this just in general previously. A biomarker is something that tracks with the severity of a disease.
Right. So we talked about aging, for example, that if you could lengthen the telomeres, it's a biomarker for aging. But if the person doesn't actually live any longer, is that really that helpful clinically? Yeah,
right. So is it causing the disease? Is it progressing the disease? Does removing it improve the disease? Or is it just something that happens as a byproduct of the disease?
Yeah.
Now, if it's just a byproduct, then it might still be useful diagnostically or prognostically, but it might not be useful therapeutically.
Right.
So this is the controversy with Alzheimer's disease, because there's a lot of biomarkers of Alzheimer's disease. A lot of stuff's happening when these cells are dying, and the amyloid beta plaque is certainly one of those things. Has had a lot of attention over many, many years.
Well, what about the other biomarkers then?
Like the tangles.
Yeah, but this is just like the tangles and other things. But this is just picking one, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but did they look at any other biomarkers?
No, because this is the one that the treatment affects. Right, they have no expectation that the other biomarkers are going to change. This is the one that is the treatment is designed to reduce.
Yeah, so in the first phases of the clinical trials, that's what they discovered. This is what the drug does.
Right, that's what it's designed to do, and that's what they claim that it does.
Yeah,
gotcha.
The problem is the trials didn't look at the net clinical outcome. They didn't show that it actually reduces the dementia, only that it reduces the amyloid beta plaque. So the question is, should we be approving a drug based upon a biomarker and not a clinical outcome?
No.
So that's one issue here.
Yeah. Why would we?
All right. We should study that first. I understand some sort of compassionate usage until we get the evidence, but...
That's the justification for it. It's like we don't have anything to treat Alzheimer's. It's a horrible disease. These people can't wait. So,
but whatever, FDA didn't even approve the COVID vaccine.
Well, I know they gave it preliminary.
Yeah, so why didn't we just do that with this drug?
Well, that's kind of what they did. The fast track approval is kind of the same thing because the company Biogen, they said, all right, we're going to approve your drug based upon these 2 biomarker trials, but you have to do a clinical trial.
Okay.
And that clinical trial has to show benefit. And if it doesn't, we will withdraw approval. But they have 9 years. They have 9 years to do that trial.
Well, that's a long time.
It's a long time where they could sell this drug with just this preliminary evidence. Now, so is it okay to use a biomarker? This is a complicated question, and I would say it depends. Again, depending on it's all risk versus benefit. Depends on the situation. But one thing you need a good reason to think that that treating the biomarker is treating the disease.
Right.
In this case, there have been 2 previous drugs that reduced amyloid beta plaque that did not improve the Alzheimer's disease.
And are they just hoping that the reviewers just didn't notice those drugs?
Since you bring up the reviewers, so let's talk about that. This is another thing that's drawing criticism. So you know that there are the reviewers who make the decisions about whether or not to approve the drug or not to. They vote, right? And then you have the advisory panel, which doesn't vote, but they just give their advice. Right. So in this case, there was an advisory panel of 11 neurologists on the central nervous system advisory panel, right? Out of the 11 neurologists who reviewed the data, 10 of them recommended rejection, not to approve the drug. And the 11th one abstained. So 0 of them recommended approval of the 11 neurologists on the advisory panel.
So they went against the advice.
Yes, they went against pretty much a unanimous vote of the advisory panel. And the different groups of that vote, so they have like the pharmaceutical people said, yeah, it does what it's supposed to do. So they voted to approve. You had the clinical people who said, yeah, this could theoretically be clinically useful. Then you had the statistics people who voted to not approve because they said, the statistics are kind of hinky.
Right, and they know a lot, those statistics people.
So let's talk about those statistics. So I said there were 2 trials. There's 2 trials, right? I'm not going to get into the weeds. I'm just going to give you the bottom line. Of the 2 trials, one of them was negative. It was just straight up negative.
Oh no.
The other trial showed a reduction in the amyloid beta plaque, but this is what the statistics experts are saying. Yeah, but they didn't really do a good job and they didn't buy it. Like, for example, they did things like they ended the trial early, which is p-hacking,
Yep. Can't do that. You got the result you wanted. Stop everything.
Yeah, stop quick before it becomes not significant.
Before we invalidate it.
So an independent statistical analysis of the data was published a few weeks ago in JAMA, and they concluded it was not statistically significant. Oh so you have 2 trials. One is negative, and the other one is contested on the statistics.
So why are we even talking about this then?
Because they approved it.
They approved it. So
this is the point. Why did they approve it based upon
then?
Why did it even get to that
expert analysis?
One negative trial and one dubious trial on a biomarker that itself is dubious when all 11 experts recommended not approving it.
Yikes.
But there's more.
But wait, there's more.
Well, there has to be something's
more.
Influencing their decision.
Well, that's a big question. I don't really have any insight into that. But they also they did this reanalysis and stuff. Anyway,
lobby pressure, just the fact that they have no options.
I don't know. It seems political. It's just a bad decision. Like they just wanted a big win on the board. I don't know. Yeah. They're trying to do the right thing, I guess, but there's just so many things here. All right, so here's another thing. This is a monoclonal antibody, right? So it means it's an infusion. You can't take it as a pill. You got to get an intravenous infusion. Guess how much 1 year's worth of treatment is going to cost? Drug alone.
This is what I was worried about.
$300,000.
25 cents.
No.
$56,000
to the patient.
$56,000.
Yeah, expensive.
Yeah.
For one patient for 1 year, $56,000.
There's no way.
What insurance company is going to do that?
You could probably double that once you include the infusion fee, right?
Of course, because you have to have a trained nurse who's standing by, and you have to have
it's expensive.
Double that?
Different things. Yeah,
probably. So it's probably going to be over $100,000 a year per patient to treat with this treatment.
Right.
What about insurance?
Well, that's a good question. That's a good question. What about insurance?
I stole that question from Kara.
They may not want to pay for it. And so, you could end up with this really only being a treatment for people who could afford to pay out of pocket, or insurance may pay just only a small part of it or whatever, but it's not going to be equitable. Let's just put it that way, which may not matter because maybe it doesn't work anyway, but still, this is a lot of healthcare dollars are going to flow into a treatment that, the probability of it actually working is in doubt. Let's just say that. Yeah. Now, there's other experts, and this is part of the reason why the experts are like, you would think that neurologists would be like, okay, hey, something's better than nothing. What's the harm? It may help. And also, this is cha-ching because if you're a neurologist and you have an infusion center, you're going to be raking it in. Every one of your Alzheimer's patients, you're going to be, so if anything, the neurological community should love this, but they're the ones who are raising the alarm bells more than anyone else. The researchers are very concerned because they say this is like you're putting out this false hope to desperate patients. It's going to make it harder to do research because who's going to want to be in a clinical trial where you might be in a placebo arm when you can get an approved drug?
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's a really
good also,
point.
It's going to be hard to do the clinical trial in this drug. Who's going to want to, again, take a chance of getting a placebo when you can get the actual drug guaranteed?
Yeah, when you just need a script from your doctor.
Exactly. So it's going to make research more difficult as well. Now, in terms of the safety, that's what I was getting to before. So because the monoclonal antibodies attack the amyloid beta plaque, it can cause them to swell. It can cause brain swelling, which can cause headaches and other symptoms. Yes, but it could also cause the swelling to cause a hemorrhage, to bleed. Now, in the trial, they had strict monitoring and endpoints. Like if you had 10 microhemorrhages, then you stopped getting therapy, and you could prevent the progression by pausing or spacing out or, again, stopping giving the treatments.
Right, but in the real world, people aren't going to be getting scans every week.
Exactly. Well, I don't think it was weekly. I think it was more like monthly.
But even still, monthly. I mean, I work with cancer patients all the time, and they get scans every 3 months, maybe. And that's people with a real fear of recurrence.
Exactly. And the FDA package insert, it recommends it at 4 months and 1 year. That's it. Wow. Nowhere near the monitoring the patients in the trial got, and also without these endpoints of you stop it if you see this or that. And so there's a question that the safety is not up there. And if you do the level of safety that they did during the trial, that adds a huge expense too, because MRIs are not cheap. That gets part of the whole expense of using this treatment as well. So,
and all that if the drug doesn't even work,
and it may not even work.
Oh,
right?
God.
Yes.
And
we have 9 years to figure it out, right?
And we talk about this a lot when we talk about like straight up snake oil, which is different, right? Like this is a drug that has undergone clinical trials. This is a drug that, unfortunately, the outcomes of those trials aren't what we want to see, and not what that advisory board wanted to see. But at least it was, looked at, and snake oil often isn't. But we talk about this whole what's the harm? And that's the answer right there. The harm is is
tons of potential harm.
Yeah, financial.
Oh gosh,
it's
you're
emotional.
you're pulling resources away from other people who have real proven means of dealing with their issues.
And you're also putting these people in a situation where there's potential false hope. It's just yuck. Mm-hmm. It's yuck.
What about also giving the whole process, the whole procedure of using monoclonal antibodies a black eye? I mean,
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Because it works so well in other places.
It's already established.
I'm not worried about that. Yeah,
okay.
I'm not worried about that. So here's one other thing about the trial itself. So in the trial, in order to get the treatment, you had to have a PET scan confirming that you actually have amyloid plaques in your brain. But that's not required to get treatment with it. And so there's lots of things that mimic Alzheimer's disease, right? It's just Alzheimer's type dementia. It's a clinical diagnosis, but you may not have the amyloid plaque.
I didn't even know you could see them, Steve.
With PET scans.
You can with PET scans. I guess because my neuroscience training, goes back to 2007 when I got my master's. And at the time, I remember learning that Alzheimer's can only definitively be diagnosed on autopsy.
That is correct.
Okay.
You need pathological diagnosis. So I don't know that this would be enough to establish the diagnosis definitively, but it is showing that at the very least you have the amyloid beta plaques, which is what the treatment is treating.
Right, but does anybody actually? I've never heard of somebody getting a PET scan to confirm.
No, we don't do it.
Yeah, we don't do it.
We don't because it doesn't affect treatment, but now it will. Right. So now either the two things can happen: either that people will get the PET scans because you need to prior to treatment, or you should prior to treatment, or insurance companies will make you get it prior to treatment, or which adds more expense, or people will treat it without the PET scan because why not?
Yeah,
because there's
and it raises whole questions about the validity of the PET scan as a diagnostic tool in this specific instance. Like, what if somebody has early Alzheimer's and the plaques aren't showing up yet in the PET scan? What if? I mean, I don't know. I don't know what the literature shows. You would think that if it was a necessary diagnostic tool, it would already be in the toolbox, but we don't really use it.
Yeah, but again, we only do we don't do brain biopsies either. But you only do it if it affects your treatment,
right.
And so. That's the thing. Now that there is a treatment that may be tied to it, then that creates a reason to do it clinically rather than just for research.
Right. A treatment that may not treat.
Right. So this whole thing is FUBAR. It's getting a lot of criticism from, I think, legitimately from a lot of different sectors. So I'm not concerned about will this taint monoclonal antibodies, Bob. What I am concerned is that it will taint the FDA at a time when we need people to trust the FDA because they approved the vaccines that are now getting us out of this pandemic.
And we're already struggling a little bit with our CDC.
Yes.
And so it's
hard.
Yeah.
So we have to tell people, trust the FDA when they approve the vaccines, but not when they approve this Alzheimer's drug. And that just complicates our messaging. So then I have to then back that up and say, but this is how you know the difference. The medical community supports the FDA in their approval of the vaccines. Right. They do not support the FDA in their approval of this drug. Yep. And so even against their own interest, as I said, this would be a cash cow if they believed in it. So against our own interest, we're saying this was not a good decision. Mm-hmm. So for the vaccine, we're saying it is a good decision. Everyone sort of lined up behind it. So I think, if you look at it from that perspective, if the FDA was making a mistake on the vaccines, they would get called out on it, just as they're getting called out for this decision.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but that's a little too nuanced, Steve. I'm sorry.
I know. I get you. People, I hear you. I totally hear you, but that's the best I got. Because they effed up in this situation, in my opinion.
Yeah. They effed it up.
Yeah.
Oh, Evan. Always coming in clutch. Can count on you.
All right, Bob, tell us about a new kind of supernova.
Yes. Yeah, I ate this one up. Researchers have officially confirmed a third fundamental type of supernova explosion called electron capture supernovae. This was published recently in the journal Nature Astronomy. Now, the star of this show is a recent supernova called SN 2018 ZD. I'm going to call it simply just ZD. The supernova was detected March 2018, about 3 hours after the explosion started.
Cool.
Almost got it. when it was happening. And it was in a galaxy called, far away, at NGC 2146, 21 million light years away. This was a special supernova when Daiichi Hiramatsu is a graduate student at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and Las Cumbres Observatory, who led the observation team. When he looked at this supernova, he said, "What's this weirdo?"
I love that.
I just love that quote. So his question stems from ZD's difference from conventional supernovas, or the apparent difference of the conventional supernovas that we're familiar with. And they fall into two broad types. The classic supernova that everyone thinks of, essentially, is that explosive endpoint of a large star. It's called a core collapse, or iron core collapse supernova. That's the one most people would think of. Big stars living its life, burning, fusing elements, and then it explodes in a huge supernova and becomes something really scary, like a neutron star or a black hole. That's this core collapse supernova. This happens to stars that have roughly greater than 10 solar masses generally. Very superficially, iron in the core essentially stops fusion, leading to the core to collapse. And then a rebound sends a shockwave outward throughout the star, causing a titanic explosion of the outer layers. And the star explodes, and we see it in visible light. But the far bigger explosion is actually released in the form of neutrinos. Little cool fact there. So what's left of our friend is a neutron star or a black hole. Now, the second type of supernova is called a thermonuclear supernova. You probably heard of supernova 1A. It's another way to refer to it. And the naming conventions are kind of complex and all over the place. So don't worry about the numbering of 1A or anything like that. So this starts with stars that are less than 8 solar masses, but they've already basically ended their lives. They created a white dwarf remnant, like our sun. Like our sun will be a white dwarf in the future. So what happens is that the white dwarf accretes matter onto it from an orbiting star, or perhaps a merger itself causes this to happen. The extra mass that accretes onto the white dwarf then compresses the core and heats it up, and essentially igniting a fusion process that then results in the white dwarf just blowing up.
Boom.
That's a supernova 1A. That's a thermonuclear supernova. And there's still a lot of major unanswered questions about this process. But we do know this. These explosions have very uniform properties, these thermonuclear supernovas. They have very uniform properties that allow us to use them as standard candles for measuring vast distances in space. In fact, it's these supernovas that we used in the late 90s to show, using them as standard candles, we use them to show that the universe is not only expanding, but the expansion is accelerating. So major discovery in astronomy. That's still an amazingly huge discovery, thanks to this type of specific supernova. So stars with masses less than 8 times of the sun's mass become white dwarfs, and they can potentially explode as a 1A or a thermonuclear supernova. And stars that have greater than 10 solar masses or so experience core collapse and become neutron stars or black holes. And that's very general, by the way. There's so many exceptions here. Like, what if you have 200 solar masses? Kind of a little bit of a different story, but not, out of scope for this news item. So what about stars that have 8 to 10 solar masses? What about them? How do they die? It's kind of like in between those two that we know. So what happens? And we weren't sure, but we did have a good theory about it. Astrophysicist Kenichi Nomoto at the University of Tokyo and his colleagues, they came up with a theory called electron capture supernovas in 1980. Now, this is the third one that I'm talking about, and it's been a long time. In 1980 is a lot of decades ago, and it took this long to get a handle on it, at least observationally. So an electron capture supernova, they've got cores that are not made of iron, but made of oxygen, neon, and magnesium. So they aren't massive enough to create iron. They'll never get that far. Now, as this specific type of star ages, some of the electrons in the core get smashed into their atomic nuclei, and essentially those electrons are gone. So this removal of electrons from the core, it lowers the electron pressure that's propping up the core, kind of like unplugging. I was trying to think of a good analogy here. It's kind of like unplugging the fan in a bouncy house. So the floor can't hold you up and it collapses. But instead of you hitting the hard, non-bouncy ground, it becomes a dense neutron star, roughly the mass of our sun. So that's it in a nutshell. Now, this theory by Nomoto hung around for decades. No one ever found a supernova that fit the bill observationally. And that's exactly what Daiichi Hiramatsu and his team did with the data from this ZD supernova. So what they did was they were able to show all of the following critical hallmarks of an electron capture supernova. Now, these are, it loses a lot of mass prior to the supernova, creating some circumstellar material in like an orbit around the star. The specific explosion itself has a very specific type of energy or amount, and in this case, it's very weak. It's just not a very strong explosion. It also has to have a specific chemical composition. It has to have a specific light curve, and a light curve is a very common tool used in astronomy, and that's essentially a graph of luminosity over time. All supernova have a specific type of light curve. In fact, the kind of crazy naming conventions, 1A, 1B, 1C, 1F, 2, blah, 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 all of those different naming conventions, they're not made according to what type of supernova it is, but what type of light curve it has. They use that to categorize all the different types of supernovae. Also, the specific star that has electron capture supernova also needs to have lots of elements in the core, like oxygen, neon, and magnesium that I mentioned. And finally, in order to have a definitive observation of this type of supernova, you need to have a progenitor identification. You need to see the star before the explosion, which is kind of hard to do unless you have archives for the Hubble Space Telescope and Spitzer. So, of course, as soon as they had this information about this ZD supernova, they went into the archives and they found it before it exploded, which was critical in this identification, of course. So for this theory, it was expected that the star had to be very specific. It had to be a super AGB star. That means super asymptotic giant branch type star. Yeah, weird name. But this name is in reference actually to where the star sits in the classic HR or, Steve, Hertzsprung-Russell diagram. Remember that, Steve?
Totally.
That's the famous, one of the most famous diagrams in astronomy. It's a very famous diagram that beautifully shows all the types of stars in the various stages of their evolution. So check it out. It's really cool. So now this specific star is perfect though, because they have these super AGB stars have a mass of 7.5 to 10 times the sun's mass. Perfect. So that means, think about it though, those numbers, that means that it's too massive to be a type 1a supernova, but it's not massive enough to become a type 2 core collapse supernova. So it's right in the sweet spot for electron capture supernovae. And so that's pretty much it. They have identified it. They have a candidate that's perfect, that kind of confirms that this type of supernova exists. But this story has one other cool aspect to it. I'm sure some of you guys have heard about the Crab Nebula, Steve. Crab Nebula, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's super famous. A nebula. It's a beautiful remnant of a supernova from our galaxy, which is awesome, that exploded from Earth's perspective, of course, in 1045 AD. Now, this thing was so bright, it was visible during the day for 23 frickin' days. 23 days, you go out at noon. Oh, look, there's a supernova. How epic would that be? And it stayed visible in the night sky for almost 2 years. And it was actually recorded by, not on camera or anything, but Chinese and Japanese skywatchers recorded it. They wrote it down. Oh, look at this, 1045 AD. There's a new star in the sky, and we could see it during the day. So it must have been an amazing thing. That's just one of the things I would just love to experience. Oh, my God.
You said that before.
Now, we have long thought that this beautiful Crab Nebula was created by electron capture supernova, right? And this latest data now proves it. We couldn't be sure because in 1045, obviously, nobody was cataloging stars and observing them with telescopes. So we couldn't, so we can never definitively say what kind of star created this. And you really kind of need to know that. But now we can really infer that information well enough where we could say, yes, the Crab Nebula was created by this an electron capture supernova. And the team lead, I'll end with a quote. Team lead Hiramatsu has a great quote regarding this. He said, it was such a eureka moment for all of us that we can contribute to closing the 40-year-old theoretical loop. And for me personally, because my career in astronomy started when I looked at the stunning pictures of the universe in the high school library, one of which was the iconic Crab Nebula taken by the Hubble Space Telescope. So I just thought it was just so cool that this guy who was the lead on this study, was looking at the Crab Nebula when he was in high school, and now he is like a major. Whenever you look up Crab Nebula in the future, you're going to see his name linked to it because he is the guy that proved that the Crab Nebula was created by an electron capture supernova.
Cool. Now we have 3 kinds of supernova.
Yeah.
Finally.
But look up hypernova if you want some extra information.
Yeah, hypernova. Well, everyone, we're going to take a quick break from our show to talk about one of our sponsors this week, Bombas Socks.
I'm at the gym quite often, and there's lots of things about workouts that make them hard, but your socks should not be one of those. That's why Bombas Performance Socks are built to be nothing but comfortable and supportive. Bombas Performance Socks have taken all the amazing innovations that make Bombas the most comfortable socks you've ever worn and added that special Hex-Tech performance technology.
It's true. They're stitched with special moisture-wicking yarn, and they've got little vents that help cool your feet and, let the air flow around. They've got this little tab in the back that protects your ankles, your heels from blisters. That's my favorite part. They've got stay-up technology and this arch-hugging system. It's so much more comfortable than any other sock I've worn. And, of course, they come in different styles for every sport with specific design features to help you optimize performance. And don't forget, just like all their socks, for every pair of Bombas Performance socks you buy, they donate a pair to someone in need. And at this point, they've donated over 45 million pairs so far. That's why Bombas are my favorite socks.
Go to bombas.com/skeptics today and get 20% off your first order. That's BOMBAS.com/skeptics for 20% off.
All right, guys, let's get back to the show. Evan, so your news item reminds me of one that we talked about before. We talked about Zealandia, right?
Mm-hmm.
That there may be a continent under New Zealand. You're going to tell us about Icelandia.
Icelandia. All hail Icelandia. This is an interesting one because an international team of geologists led by Gillian Folger, who is an emeritus professor of geophysics in the Department of Earth Sciences at Durham University in the United Kingdom. She and her team believe they have identified a sunken continent hidden under Iceland and the surrounding ocean. And as you said, Steve, they've dubbed it Icelandia. When I first heard sunken continent, my mind obviously goes to Atlantis and thinking like, oh, okay, here we go. Here comes a news story about, they found Atlantis, the latest version of this. But no. This one's actually rooted in some science here. This news item came about from the Geological Society of America's forthcoming book that they're publishing entitled In the Footsteps of Warren B. Hamilton, New Ideas in Earth Science. And here's the abstract basically explaining from one of the chapters in that book that we propose a new sunken continent beneath the North Atlantic Ocean that we name Icelandia. It may comprise blocks of full-thickness continental lithosphere or extended magma-inflated continental layers that form hybrid continental oceanic lithosphere. I got the word hybrid in there for Jay, but he's not here. Damn you. It underlies the Greenland-Iceland Faroe Ridge and then the Jan Mayen microplate complex. But basically what they're saying is it covers an area of 600,000 square kilometers.
Whoa.
It's contiguous with the Faroe Plateau and known parts of the submarine continental rifted margin offshore Britain. And if you include those in what they said could be considered Greater Icelandia, the entire area is over 1 million square kilometers in size. That's big. Larger than Australia. So, use that for your kind of frame of reference. So there you go.
Evan, is it official? Is it an official?
No, it's not. It's not official yet. But here's basically what they're saying is that the Professor Folger, she puts it in her own words, and she said that until now Iceland has puzzled geologists as existing theories that it is built of and surrounded by oceanic crust, but it's not supported by multiple geological data. For example, the crust under Iceland is over 40 kilometers thick, which is 7 times thicker than normal oceanic crust, and it simply could not be explained. And that does make sense. Continental crust is significantly thicker than the oceanic crust. So they said that when they considered the possibility that this thick crust is continental, our data suddenly all made sense, and it led us to immediately realize that the continental region was much bigger than Iceland itself, that there's a hidden continent right there under the sea. Yeah, obviously more testing, more analysis has to be done. This is a new proposition, and it's really an interesting one. But the idea that Iceland, or the much larger Icelandia, is continental crust instead of oceanic crust is significant. It would mean a reexamination of a lot of things, especially in this area of the planet. So it brings up the question of Pangaea, the once mighty megacontinent that ruled the Earth 250 million years ago. We've talked about that before. Mm-hmm. So essentially, if Icelandia is continental crust, and it's as vast and expansive as the researchers are describing, then how does that fit into the larger Pangaea puzzle? Pangaea did not fully break up along the mid-Atlantic, but instead they're saying it stretched out. One description had it akin to a string of cheese hanging between two parting pizza slices. I like that vision, or that image, which left Icelandia's continental crust crossing the divide. So there's questions about that. Also, the understanding of volcanic formation of a place like Iceland needs to be looked at in this new context. So if Icelandia does exist, as Professor Folger explained, it would remove the need to imagine this hotspot of upwelling magma beneath Iceland to explain its formation and geology of the Iceland Plateau. So that winds up getting re-examined in this context as well. But there's also more immediate and practical concerns, perhaps, because if this is continental crust, well, there you have a new source of minerals and hydrocarbons that were not known before. And then geopolitical questions arise as to where do countries' mining rights begin and end. And there's always the ever-present environmental concerns that go hand in hand with those sorts of things. So there is something called the United Nations Convention on the Law of Sea, which grants coastal states exclusive rights to the non-living resources of their adjacent seabed if scientists can prove that the seabed's a submerged extension of the continental landmass. So you're going to have, I don't know to what extent, territorial disputes that could arise as part of this.
Yeah, so this is not an abstract scientific question. This has implications for international law. And Iceland, obviously, they would benefit if they showed this is a continent, because now they have rights to all to Icelandia,
right?
To everything there. Yeah.
But my gosh, it stretches, from Greenland to Britain, mm-hmm. In a nice big swath of land underneath. That's enormous. I mean, it really is huge. So, but they need more information about it. So more testing needs to be done, more research needs to be done. And that's the next phase that this team is now working on. They're going to collaborate with scientists from around the world to help test this theory. And they're going to begin in earnest once COVID-19 restrictions allow them to do that kind of work. But it would involve electrical conductivity surveys, the collection of zircon crystals in Iceland and other areas, and tests for seismic profiling and some drilling tests as well. So we're going to hear a lot more about this. It's not, like you said, Steve, it's not going to be some abstract scientific argument or philosophical argument going on. There's going to be some real players involved here, and probably a lot of money going into the research as well. So a whole new continent to explore in a way. Let's hope we don't muck it up too badly. That's always my concern.
Yeah, well, we'll definitely have to keep an eye on this, and if there's any follow-up, which may be years, but we'll report on it. All right, Kara, this is an interesting one. Evidence regarding a shorter work week.
Yeah, and we're headed back to Iceland.
Yeah.
So Iceland-centric show. Yeah, so there was a 4-year experiment that was recently published by the Association for Sustainable Democracy out of Iceland. That's the ALDA, and the UK-based think tank Autonomy. It was just published on July 4th, and it was based on multiple trials within Iceland, and there were two major trials that were done. One of them was at the national level, and the other one, the Icelandic government trial, and the other one was the Reykjavik City trial. Reykjavik City trial was between 2014 and 2019. The Icelandic government trial was 2017 to 2021. And what they did is they shortened the work week to 35 or 36 hours, with no reduction in pay.
Was it 40 to start?
From 40.
Yeah, it was 40 to start.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. And then they compared groups. So the analysis included 2,500 workers, and that actually represents, because Iceland has a very small population, so that represents over 1% of their entire working population. They looked at outcomes from the study and found some very interesting things. Many of these things are not new, and I have pulled up a few other studies from way back when. These results just bolster the results that we've seen across the board. Productivity remained the same or improved. Well-being dramatically increased across multiple different self-report indicators. So they looked at things like perceived stress and burnout. They looked at health outcomes. They looked at work-life balance. For example, workers saying that they had time to finally work out, or that they were able to spend more time with their family, that they felt less stressed, across the board, they were just feeling better. Interestingly, a lot of people said that at first they had to really adjust because they were like, how am I going to be as productive? How am I going to do the same amount of work in fewer hours? And they were a little stressed about it, but very quickly they realized that they could cut down on meeting times, that they could, make some efficiency changes to their work, and they were able to maintain productivity. And now in Iceland, to get this, based on the outcomes of these trials, the government has, maybe it's actually not governmental. I'm not sure. This wasn't made clear if it was a mandate or if it was just a choice that most businesses made, but that 86% of the country's workforce is now working shorter hours based on the outcomes of this trial.
So how does that work? Is it an hour or so less a day? Is it half day Fridays? How do they work that?
So it doesn't say, at least in the first trial, whether it was a half day on Friday or every other Friday being off, or a 7-hour day instead of an 8-hour day. It probably depended. They probably gave some latitude to the different companies to do what worked best, because we're talking a range of different places, like everything from service to office work to hospitals.
Okay.
Yeah. And so they probably had to adapt that based on their needs. And what's interesting is that I shared this, a write-up of this study on social media, and people started responding like, hey, did you read about what Microsoft did in Japan in 2019? And they shared an article from way back then where in Japan, Microsoft tested a 4-day work week, and they found, and this was, with their own internal metrics, it was in the summer of 2019, they gave their entire 2,300 person workforce in Japan 5 days off in a row. They didn't change their pay. They didn't change anything. They just said, hey, you're going to have Fridays off for the next 5 weeks. And your mandate is to work a short time, rest well, learn a lot, but try your best to get the same amount of work done in that time, right? Like try and, maintain productivity. And they actually found that productivity went up 40%.
What?
Yeah.
Whoa, that's quite a return on that investment.
Of course, the question is, how sustainable is that? Is that
how sustainable is it?
Observer
All
effect
of these were
kind of thing. Yeah.
Right. Was this a short-term? It was a short-term trial. Was it the excitement of this like, ooh, it's a big change? Do we adapt? Is part of the reason that we're not very productive, or that our productivity is what it is because it's just such the norm here in the United States that we work 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. But interestingly, I looked at some other studies, like a compilation of studies that was published in 2015 in Science Alert, where one article out of Boston University was looking at people who worked 80 hours a week, and they were finding, not good for you. Like, not only could, and they were looking at consultants, not only could managers and people that they worked with not tell the difference between a consultant who actually worked 80 hours a week and one who feigned that they worked 80 hours a week. Like, they literally could not tell the difference in their productivity. They also they had increases in stress, burnout, impaired sleep, depression, diabetes, heavy drinking, heart disease, higher risk of stroke. And also, here's an interesting thing. When you looked at the Microsoft situation where they took the Fridays off for 5 weeks in a row, and this is not a temporary thing, this would be sustainable. Electricity use was down 23% in the office. 59% fewer pages of paper were printed. I don't know about the sustainability of this, but 92% of employees said, yeah, we like this better, of course. So you think about just the amount, and we've seen big changes during the pandemic with forced adaptability to a work from home schedule where childcare costs are no longer, I mean, sometimes they are as high and as relevant because some people simply cannot work at home without childcare there in their homes. But some people are able to manage both. Some people are able to stack their duties in such a way that they get their work done for the week and then they have that time off. It really depends on the flexibility and the type of work that they're doing. But we've seen that with this adaptability, yes, things like electric bills, things like air conditioning, not just costs, but pollutants that come from running the air conditioner, use of physical paper in the office. These are things that have massive impact on our planet. They go down. So it's not just an improvement in health and human safety, in psychological benefits, and in actual productivity of the companies. It's also an improvement for the planet.
And traffic goes down too.
So, way down.
Yeah. And it's sort of the same thing with working from home. Like the traffic on my commute is still less than it was pre-pandemic. And it's so, I mean, I save, 20, 30 minutes a day.
Wow.
Plus all of the attendant fuel, just on my reduced commute time, just because I'm never stuck in traffic. It's just, it was reduced just enough that it's, the traffic flows really nicely. So this would further do that. Like if people were going in 4 days a week and it was a little staggered, like some people take Monday off, some people take Friday off, whatever. If you need to, to be open for 5 days, or, there's already businesses where you're open 6 or 7 days a week, you still stagger it. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of potential advantages. Also, I think people find that they waste so much time in their work week. There's a lot of unnecessary meetings, et cetera. And if you really needed to get the work done, you could totally do it.
Yeah, my favorite meme, or just like that, you've all seen the ribbon that said, I survived a meeting that could have been an email, right? Yeah. Like this is such an experience in corporate America. And that's the thing. People adapt. They figure out where to get rid of redundancies. They figure out how to focus a little bit more or to work a little bit more efficiently. And ultimately, I mean, whether or not certain outcome measures are sustainable in the long run versus a more short-term study, although the Icelandic study is interesting because it was a little bit more long-term. They were looking over years. Whether those things maintain across the board, I do think that it's probably safe to say that at least from a face validity perspective, people are happier working less. If they can work less and they can have a more well-rounded life, spend more time with their family, run the errands they need to, go to the doctor's appointments. That's the other thing that I saw. I think it was on the Microsoft one that people took less time off of work.
Right, because you don't have to take a personal day to go to a doctor's appointment. You could just put it on your day off anyway.
Yeah, or even if you didn't, like you might be just more likely to, you're not so burnt out that you're not getting sick as often. Like there's so many different reasons for that. So yeah, just like across the board, the benefits definitely seem to outweigh the downsides, of which I haven't found any in this published study. Yeah, I think a lot of times we do things out of tradition. We do things because of fear of change. And I would love to see here in the U.S., because of course that's where we're broadcasting from, I would love to see a little bit more evidence-based government, evidence-based policy, because we're seeing that, whole countries are adopting these changes.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. Like, there's nothing magical about the 40-hour work week. People just do it because that's the standard. And I think a lot of times they make work to fill the time, like those unnecessary meetings. And I think you absolutely. Yep. I mean, this is never going to affect me because of the kind of work that I do. there's no fluff in my day. I'm just seeing patients all day, you know.
Right. But we even for medical students and residents, for example, we are starting to see minimal. I would love to see the changes happen more dramatically. But when we look at the actual evidence, when you force a med student or a resident to work long hours, we're talking like these 80-hour weeks or these overnight shifts that are rotating between day shifts and night shifts, who ends up carrying the cost of that? The patients.
That's already gone, though, Kara. The ACGME rules have completely transformed that. There are strict rules on how many hours you can work in a row, how many hours you can work a week. Every so often, you need to have like full days off.
They're still not great, though.
It's still hard work. It's still hard work, no doubt, but it's night and day from the way it was before those changes.
Right.
Those crazy like 36-hour work days, they're gone. They're totally
Oh, yeah, that's good. This kind of talk.
Yeah, I don't want my doctor to have been working for 36 hours before he sees me.
This kind of talk always reminds me of the Jetsons episode where George is at work. He's sitting there and he's like, these 3-hour work days are killing me.
It's awful. Yep.
All right. So no Who's That Noisy this week is Jay's away. He'll pick them up when he joins us again. I'm actually not sure if Jay's going to be on the show next week because he's traveling on our recording day, but we'll see if he can do it. In any
Shaking my fist at Jay right now.
Yeah, we are going to go to a question. I didn't get the emailer's name, but they write, as skeptics, do we have faith or do we believe? These words seem to require a sort of religious or emotional perspective. For example, I do believe my children love me, or do I simply know it? Do we have faith in science? I happen to like these words, but not sure if they are still meaningful. Yeah, I like this question because we do get this a lot, and I don't think there's any clean answer here because...
No, there's no right answer to this question.
It's because
it's personal.
First of all, there's this divide between the colloquial use of these words and a more technical use. And I think people use them colloquially and then they get held to some sort of technical definition, which may be vague. So faith is probably the trickiest one because it is so tied to religion.
Yeah, got a lot of baggage.
Yeah, so I usually avoid using that word because I don't think it has sort of an honestly. Well, I should take that back. It does, but it only in very, like, you might have faith in a person.
Yeah, people.
And people understand that doesn't mean like you believe they're anything magical. It's just that it just means you know them well enough that and you trust them and you believe in them and you're willing to quote unquote have faith in them. So
this is interesting, Steve, from the early 14th century, and granted faith goes way back to the 13th century. In the 13th century, faithfulness to a trust or a promise, loyalty to a person, honesty, truthfulness. But 14th century, assent of the mind to the truth of a statement for which there's incomplete evidence. Mm-hmm. And that's when it started to have a more religious connotation.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
Right. So I still tend to avoid it just because, again, it has that baggage. But, I don't, if somebody uses it in that benign sense, or if somebody uses it in the literal sense, like their religious faith, as long as they're, using it appropriately. Believe is probably the harder one. And in terms of, because we use that all the time colloquially, and it's kind of a shorthand, and it would be silly if like every time you have to say that like you believe in something, you have to give some long philosophical, epistemological description of what you actually mean. It would be ridiculous.
On the flip side of that, doing the same thing with an epistemological statement of knowledge or truth or evidence-based also offers the same problems. Like if you say to your partner, I know my love for you is real, and they're like, let's look at the evidence. It's just as frustrating. It's just as undermining. Like, I think that the constructs of these terms are contextual.
Yeah.
We use them depending on the context. And of course, if we're having a logical argument about evidence-based policy, it's a completely different conversation than, like you said, if you say, I know I love you, or I believe that we're going to get through this, or I believe that I'm going to finish this project on time. Like that's, That's fine.
It could be a statement of hope, even. But here's the thing: when someone says, "Do you believe in evolution?"
Right. That's
now
very different.
that's very different.
There you go.
Then you may have to start parsing what you mean by believe.
And that's when you can say, I mean, what I used to always say to my students when I used to teach, intro biology back in the day, both in Texas and New York, where I had heavy religious populations within my students. And they would say, Professor, do you believe in evolution? And I would say, I don't have to believe in it because there's plenty of evidence that supports its reality.
Yeah. Which again, it's sort of playing with the word, but then you're just trying to prevent being deliberately misunderstood.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Exactly.
And that's the thing when people weaponize colloquial shorthand and try to hold you to a technical meaning. They call that making a semantic argument. That's just lowball. I don't like that at all. But if if it is the discussion like what is our attitude towards this area of knowledge, then we start to talk about things like epistemology. But in everyday parlance, just don't try to unfairly hold people to a technical definition they didn't intend. Allow them to get away with their shorthand.
So much context.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and epistemology is something that I think most skeptics should at least become familiar with. How do we know what we know? What are the different ways of knowing? And what do they mean? I think that sometimes what I worry about within the skeptical community is that there's a lack of philosophical, there's a lack of interest in, philosophical definitions of these things. So there becomes this blind, logical, positivist view that unless something has evidence to support it, it's not even a relevant conversation to have. It's like, we can't use the scientific method for everything.
It's a dismissive attitude. It's
Yeah, like it just doesn't apply to a lot of things. Like it's not ethical to do certain types of experiments, or there's certain things that we just don't have the tools to investigate in that way. And that doesn't make those things non-existent or irrelevant in life. I mean, they're still important conversations to have.
Yeah, context is critical. But also, I do think that people will overuse the word know. Like they will say, I know something when they really don't, when they really believe it or suspect it, or sometimes they really do think they know it when they don't. They're just
Dunning-Kruger.
You're so right.
Being massively overconfident. Like they're just speculating about other people's motivations. For example, they did this for this reason. You don't know that. Don't use the word "know" when it's completely inappropriate. So I do think that is a time when it's legitimate to call people on using a word, because it's even in its colloquial meaning, it's wrong. It's not like I'm holding them to a technical meaning. Even the way they're using it, it's not appropriate. We
see this a lot in religious views, right? And it's a distinction that I often make, and we don't talk much about our own religious views on the show because this is a science show until they become, relevant from a skeptical perspective. Like I identify as an atheist, and many times people ask me, well, how can you say you're an atheist and not an agnostic? How can you say you know? And my response is always, I don't know. It's not that I believe there is no God. It's that I simply lack a belief in God. I simply don't believe in God. Those are two important, I think that's an important distinction. But then my argument is one that came from a book that I read a long time ago called Atheism, the Case Against God by Smith. And he sort of makes the argument that everybody's an agnostic because nobody knows whether you have fervent faith.
That's the whole point, right?
Yeah. So at that point, it's a redundant term. You either live your life as if there were a theistic, whether it's mono, poly, whatever, or you live your life with a lack of theism guiding it. And I live my life in an atheistic way. But of course, I am technically an atheistic agnostic. It's just agnostic to me becomes redundant because there are theistic agnostics. Nobody knows.
Right.
We don't have tools to investigate.
Knowable.
Exactly.
Knowable.
That's by definition.
Yet there are plenty that claim to know for sure.
Exactly.
Some people are not agnostic in that they won't recognize their own necessary agnosticism. They pretend as if they can know. I know God. No, you don't. That you have
and
faith in God.
I've met some atheists who are the same way.
Sure. Yeah, it's true.
Our dear friend Sean Carroll, I have him on tape once we were doing a panel, and he was like, I can use physics to prove to you that there is no God. And I was like, okay, my friend.
That's awesome.
Maybe only certain kinds of gods, but...
Yeah.
All right. Well, everyone, we're going to take a quick break from our show to talk about one of our sponsors this week, Wondrium.
You know, sometimes we watch TV, we watch movies, we listen to podcasts to escape, to relax, to kind of shut our brains down. And other times we want to be inspired. We want to learn something new. And that is what Wondrium offers you. We're talking thousands of audio and video learning experiences that feed our curiosity. Chock full of fun and exciting content from top experts and storytellers. We've got documentaries, tutorials, different kinds of collections, and of course, all our favorites from the great courses.
Yeah, right now I'm working my way through a course called Robotics. I know, not unusual. 24 lectures, a lot of great topics. It talks about how to designing robots, robots designed after humans, after animals, flying robots, robots in space, robots in the factory, just like everything you ever wanted to know about robots. I'm really enjoying it. It's a great lecture.
Join us and experience your own mind-blowing moments with Wondrium. Right now, listeners can get this exclusive offer, a 21-day free trial of unlimited access to the entire library. Go now to Wondrium.com/skeptics. You won't find this anywhere else. That's WONDRIUM.com/skeptics. Wondrium.com/skeptics.
All right, guys, let's get back to the show. We're going to do a Name That Logical Fallacy. This is based on an email. The email goes, "My name is Adam Mather, and I'm a 20-year-old from Cincinnati, Ohio, and have been listening to your show consistently for 2 years now. Recently, I had been brushing up on my logical fallacies and thought of a scenario that I couldn't quite pin down as a single logical fallacy. In a situation where a student goes to their professor, who is very highly regarded in their niche field of research, with a groundbreaking paper that had been written years prior, the professor replies, 'Well, that must be rubbish. I've never heard of such an idea, and I've studied every aspect of this field for decades.' My problem with this is that it seems like an obvious case of an argument from personal incredulity. However, would it be illogical to assume that an expert in their field would know about a fundamental discovery if it had been in the scientific literature for years? Could it also be considered an argument from authority? Thank you guys for everything you do. Science communicators and educators like you guys are real-life superheroes, making the world a better place to live." Had to include that. Always happy to be called a superhero. All right. So what do you guys think about Adam's fallacy here? That can't be legitimate, because if it were, I would have heard about it.
There's a difference between an individual person saying that can't be legitimate because I've never heard of it, and an entire field saying that can't be legitimate because we collectively never heard of it. Mm-hmm. Because individual people can be wrong. He might have overlooked it, right?
Yeah. It depends on a lot of things. Yeah. I think it depends how fundamental this thing is that he doesn't have knowledge of, that's been around for years.
Are we taking at face value that this is a legitimate study and a legitimate, that the entire
I don't think so.
Research? Oh, we're not. Okay. So
I feel like that's that part of the point.
Matters.
We don't know. I mean, that's the point. This is you're just presented. It doesn't assume one way or the other. It's just you're presented with a paper that you haven't heard of. Can you assume it's not valid because you haven't heard about it? Is that first of all, I would say I don't think this is an argument from personal incredulity. That is more like, I can't imagine this to be the case. This doesn't make any sense to me. This doesn't fit within my worldview. This is different. This is closer to an argument from authority.
Yes.
It's saying that my knowledge of this field is so thorough that anything that I don't know about is not a legitimate part of this field. Now, I have to say that I think there are people for whom that statement is completely reasonable. If it's a small enough field and you're a world expert who goes to all the meetings and talks to, and you know every single expert in this field personally, because you've worked with them, and there's a lot of people like that, and you can absolutely say, what you're really saying is this has not penetrated into this field of study. No one in the field is aware of it. Because if they were, I would be aware of it. Anybody who goes to all the meetings and, reads all the journals and, would have encountered this. That's a legitimate, that's a perfectly legitimate observation if you are such a person. And that's not a argument from authority, logical fallacy. That's just a statement of probability. But you could, the only thing you could say is, as an alternate view, maybe this would have to have been for some reason a neglected study that somehow flew under the radar.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Or it's something that, and this has happened historically, it's less likely to happen now because we've become so, like our resolution has increased dramatically within the sciences. But historically, somebody might have published a paper within a field and the powers that be within the field scoffed at the assertions and said, this is, we're not going to publish this in a legitimate journal. And so they had to go to some cut rate journal, or they were like, we're not going to give this the time of day. And it never even entered into the discourse, whereas it might have been a legitimate idea that did not fit with the paradigm or the zeitgeist of the time. That's less likely to happen now. Mm-hmm. I think, than it was historically, but that did used to happen.
Sure, absolutely.
And then the paper would come about, like we'd rediscover it 50 years later and be like, oh shit, this guy was onto something.
Yeah, totally. So there's a lot of different permutations here. It all depends on how big the field is, how many people are involved, where this guy is in the hierarchy or this person. And so, for example, like if they would be one of the powers that be that would have rejected it, then they would probably remember it.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
But it's also possible, like we see this in medicine all the time, where perfectly legitimate studies get published in a journal that is read by somebody in a different subspecialty. Mm-hmm. For whatever reason, like there might be something published in the diabetes literature that affects neurology because it's like a neurological complication of diabetes. And as a neurologist, I may have missed it because it was published in a diabetes journal and not in the neurological literature. So that happens all the time. Or it's published in another language and you don't see it because of that reason.
That has happened.
Totally.
For sure.
But now that's getting better because, I don't need to physically get delivered a journal to know what's in it now because because the
online,
internet
will translate everything for you.
Yeah, not only that, but just I might see anything relevant to my interest, even if I'm not subscribing to that particular journal. So it's definitely much better than it was in the past, where if you didn't get the physical journal, you didn't see it. But it still can happen. It could still happen.
There's, of course, the other big or, which is that this professor is kind of old. They're kind of a narcissist, and they're not actually keeping up with the literature the way that they think they are. Mm-hmm. And I think that is an important scenario to bring up, that there are plenty of scientists who held a certain position within their field for so long that the idea that they're no longer that well-read or they're no longer that expert because the field has changed so much underneath them is incredulous to them. And I think that might be the argument from incredulity or whatever that they were mentioning. That
maybe, but it's more of a false premise.
Legit.
It's more of a false premise. Is the premise that he would know? A false
premise. Yeah.
That he would have known is false because he's overestimating how plugged in
his
he
own
is.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I wouldn't put that. I think I read the email as to like that being the scenario, or at least I guess one of the possible scenarios, that is just a professor who like thinks they're hotter shit than they are, or thinks they're more relevant than they are, and can't fathom the fact that they would have overlooked something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, obviously there's a lot of permutations possible here, but and it's not necessarily a fallacy if all the pieces are legitimate, right? If all the premises are true and it's being applied the right way, it's not necessarily a fallacy. Okay, but that was an interesting question.
Yeah.
Thank you, Adam. All right, guys, let's move on to science or fiction.
It's time for science or fiction.
Each week I come up with 3 science news items or facts, 2 real and 1 fake, and then I challenge my panel of skeptics to tell me which one is the fake. We have a theme this week, and that theme is science myths.
Oh,
no.
Myths about scientific discovery or research, not necessarily science facts, or myths about scientists, let's say.
Oh, boy.
Okay. Item number 1. The claim that Einstein's first wife, Mileva Merrick, silently collaborated with Einstein in developing the theories of relativity is not supported by any evidence and generally considered by historians to be untrue. Item number 2. Despite their legendary status, the Galapagos finches do not appear to have been important to Darwin's development of his theory and go unmentioned in On the Origin of Species. And number 3, while Alexander Fleming is credited with the serendipitous discovery of penicillin, he never considered its therapeutic potential and was not cited in the later work that actually developed penicillin as a drug. Evan, go first.
Oh, damn, this Einstein one is hurting me. So his first wife silently collaborated with Einstein in developing the theories of relativity, saying that it's not supported by any evidence and generally considered by historians to be untrue. Yeah, what did I read about this? Gosh, I read it in Walter Isaacson's book.
Yeah,
I mean, he talks about her a lot, about Mileva, and a lot in that book. But I'm trying to remember, was it in the context that she actually did help, or was she more or less just kind of taking care of all the aspects of Einstein's life so he could do his work? Oh, gosh, this one is driving me crazy a little bit. The other two. So, yeah, Galapagos finches. Gosh, who hasn't grown up learning about those? I mean, since what, 4th grade science class? But not important to Darwin's development of his theory. And go unmentioned in On the Origin of Species. Well, that's possible. Boy, it's so prevalent though in the whole Darwin legend. For lack of a better term, it's hard to sort of decouple the two. It's so ingrained, but I have a feeling that one will wind up being a science. And then the last one, Alexander Fleming, his discovery of penicillin and never considered it therapeutic potential. Yeah, I mean, the story goes that it was an accident, right? The discovery was so. If that were the case, you know, when you have these accidental sort of discoveries, do you put any thought into the potential of what's going on with what you've discovered, therapeutic or otherwise? Or is it overlooked? That's possible as well. Boy, the one about Einstein's really sticking in my craw. Am I just going to put my nickel down on that one? Mileva, he did meet her in at university though, and she was taking science. She was in physics classes. I'll say the one about Einstein, therefore, is the fiction. Yeah, because that one's just rubbing me the wrong way.
Okay, Bob.
Yeah, this is good, Steve. Damn, this is frustrating. All right, so I'll say that the first one with Einstein's collaboration with his first wife, I think that depends how you define collaboration. I think he talked to other people, especially for some of the fine details of the math. Collaborating is one thing, a little help here and there is one thing, but if she offered, incredibly insightful, input, then that would be a different beast. So I'll say that one could be science. Let's go to the third one here, the penicillin. Yeah, I've got some unreliable memory about what happened after he discovered penicillin, and I remember being surprised. So I'll say that one's potentially science as well. That leaves the finches. Yeah, I'll just say that one's fiction. I'm not very confident.
And Kara.
This is hard. I mean, I watched Genius, the series by Nat Geo, and they showed Mileva being very important to Einstein's work, like collaborating with, like actually not just supporting him emotionally and psychologically, but supporting him, like editing his pages, like pushing back when he would assert things and saying, I need you to explain this more. I need to see a better proof for this, or have you thought about it this way? And I think she had a PhD in physics. Or no, she didn't. Neither did Einstein. I forgot. But yeah, they did. She did ultimately study. Like, she was a hardcore physicist. So I don't know. That one bothers me. The fact that she wasn't helpful at all. I don't know. That feels sexist and gross. The Alexander Fleming one, he never considered its therapeutic potential. I don't see how that's the case. He didn't just randomly discover it. I mean, he did kind of, but he was a microbiologist, right? He wasn't just like some random dude. Like, this guy was, I think, working as a microbiologist. Like, he would have gotten why this matters. And so the finches one is the one that's left for me too. And maybe the reason this is the trip up is because maybe it never made it into On the Origin of Species, but maybe it was like in his HMS Beagle. He wrote all about the Galapagos in a different book. And so maybe the finches were in a different book. And he didn't really need to talk about them on The Origin of Species. That's the one thing that's sticking out to me that maybe I'm going to go with Bob on that.
Is that it?
Yeah, we'll see. Yeah, that's it.
Okay. So Bob and Kara think the Finches one is the fiction. Evan, you think the Einstein one is the fiction. So you all agree on the third one. So we'll start there. While Alexander Fleming is credited with the serendipitous discovery of penicillin, he never considered its therapeutic potential and was not cited in the later work that actually developed penicillin as a drug. You all think that one is science, and that one is the fiction.
Oh, no.
Swept.
Damn. He was a microbiologist, though, right?
He absolutely was. So that's the point. He was a microbiologist. He was doing a lot of research on, bacteria. So here's the story. Alexander Fleming, the whole story of, he was actually doing research, or there was other research being done in the place where he was on the penicillium fungus. He ran a messy lab. He had, old, bacterial plates stacked up, and the fungus got into some of his bacteria with Staph aureus, and it killed it, right? Wherever there was a little spot of a fungus growing around it, the bacteria would be dead because it was secreting the penicillium, which was killing off the Staph aureus. He made that observation. He completely understood the implication of that. He wasn't the first one to make that observation, but he definitely made it. But what he did do was publish a paper saying, hey, this penicillium fungus is killing off the surrounding bacteria. It's probably secreting something that could be used as an antibiotic, right? So he did recognize the therapeutic potential. Where he fell short was he was never able to develop it into a workable drug. He didn't think it had properties that would make it pharmacologically useful, and he let it drop. Right, he never, but the ball was picked up later by two other researchers. So this was Florey and Chain. Right, so Howard Florey and Sir Ernst Boris Chain. They were the ones who then took that idea, and they do cite Fleming's work. So they did cite Fleming's work, and they were able to develop it into an actual pharmaceutical. And Florey, Chain, and Fleming shared the Nobel Prize. So
well, then this feels like not the fiction, because you said it was not cited in the later work, but it was, and said he never considered its therapeutic potential, and
he did.
He did.
That's why it's the fiction.
I'm so sorry.
I know.
Oh my God! Yeah,
it's a twist.
It's all right.
Yeah.
You need a shorter work week, Kara.
Clearly.
Seriously.
All right, so let's go back. Despite their legendary status, the Galapagos finches do not appear to have been important to Darwin's development of his theory and go unmentioned on The Origin of Species. This one
Why didn't I pick that one?
Science.
I'm so confused.
I know.
I said out loud.
Which myth is the fiction? I know. It's
oh my
kind of
God. I was like, no, he's a microbiologist. Of course he considered its therapeutic potential.
Didn't he write a finch book?
Oh my God.
No, he wrote a book on
snails.
He
loved snails.
Or what was the other one? It was
he loved snails, and he loved, what are the barnacles?
Barnacles. Yeah, we held the barnacle.
Yes,
remember we held one?
So this is a complicated story, as you might imagine, but let me hit some of the highlights here. So when Darwin was writing, when he was cataloging nature that he encountered in the Galapagos Islands, he was doing it prior to really having fleshed out his theory of natural selection and evolution. He still believed in evolution, that that species can change. That idea was already put in his head, unlike Captain Fitzroy, who was a creationist. But he hadn't developed his theory of natural selection, and he actually did quite a bad job of cataloging what he found. From like a modern evolutionist would have done a much better job. So
right, because he had no idea what he was doing. Like, he was learning on the job, and
he didn't know what he was doing.
There.
So, for example, he for most of the voyage, he wasn't keeping careful track which island the specimens came from, which of course would be critical, in terms of his theory. And he also misidentified most of the birds that he collected. So like
what a punk.
And he didn't collect all of the different finches that were there. So at the time, it really wasn't like there was no aha moment from the finches themselves. And the finches had to be later categorized by another expert that he relied upon, Gould. And he had to rely on his captain's part of his collection because he didn't really do a good job of collecting it himself. But all that aside, the idea of this adaptive radiation with the finches having like their beaks were specialized to their feeding behavior and everything, that was not part of Darwin's evolutionary thinking. The only thing that the birds in general contribute to, and the only mention that they get on the Origin of Species, is just the more general observation that islands have animals that look like the continent they're next to, not their own environment. So you have an island off the coast of Africa and an island off the coast of South America that are very similar, but their fauna is very different, but looks like the continent they're next to. Right. So that was his line of reasoning. It had nothing to do with the finches or their adaptive radiation. And he doesn't specifically mention finches, like the word finches does not appear on the Origin of Species.
What is wrong with me?
Evolution only appears once.
You had the right argument, but you picked the wrong one.
Why did I? It's like I forgot how to play this game. I literally read that and said, I believe that to be true. So I'll say that's the fiction. What is wrong with me?
Yeah. An unforced error. That's what we call it, Kara. An unforced error.
Jeez. This is too much work on other things.
This is going to stick in your
I need a, is that your final answer situation?
Yeah. I did say that. I did ask if that was your answer. No, here's the thing. The myth of like the centrality of the finches comes from the 1940s. There was a book called Darwin's Finches, and that kind of solidified this story, in the public consciousness. But it really, it was never central, to his development of natural selection or, the theory of evolution.
I wonder if he did write about them in the what is it called?
He didn't. The Beagle. That's the other thing. He didn't. So he had a much more extensive book, that he was working on. And he really doesn't ever use the finches to develop the idea of natural selection, even in his broader work. It just was not central to his thinking, which is interesting. That's one of the main sources. Again, history is always like you're trying to reconstruct it. There's no like total home run. That's kind of why I put some very specific things in there, like not mentioned or not cited or whatever, because that's way more objective. But otherwise they're just trying to infer from the historical record, and it's just that it's amazing how little they are mentioned in Darwin's writings. And then that's evidence that they really weren't used to develop the theory. All right, let's go back to number one. The claim that Einstein's first wife, Mileva Merrick, silently collaborated with Einstein in developing the theories of relativity is not supported by any evidence and generally considered by historians to be untrue. Evan, you thought this one was the fiction, but this is also science. And again, generally considered by historians. What are the lines of evidence here? So just to clear up some of the speculation that you guys were saying. So first, Einstein absolutely had a PhD, Kara. He got it in 1905. He got his PhD with his very short paper explaining the photoelectric effect. Got him.
So this was after he worked as a clerk.
Nobel Prize for that.
Got a Nobel Prize and his PhD.
The only one he ever got.
The
only one he ever got. How ridiculous is that?
So, he did. Mileva did not complete her PhD. She did not complete it because, she just wasn't up to that level, is the bottom line. So because she got pregnant with Einstein's baby? She then later got pregnant, but she... I don't think that was later. Well, let me put from what I remember. Again, whatever, we could... Their books literally have been written about this, but from what I've been reading in preparation for this... Probably by men. She didn't get her PhD because basically she just couldn't do the work. But who knows how much sexism was at play at that time? But the bottom line is, hard enough for her to even. She was, by the way, the only woman in the department. Yeah, so that's not central to the case here. What's central to the case here was when a lot of their personal letters were revealed. So now you have this extensive conversation in letters between Mileva and Einstein, right? And Einstein is pitching all of his ideas to her. She never raises any ideas to him. So what the historians think is that he may have been using her as a sounding board, but she was not contributing any novel ideas or anything to his development of his theory. She was not contributing any of the math. Again, she may have been existing in a supportive role, but not a collaborative role.
Yeah.
And the historians do cite, I think, as you said, Evan, her main role was in allowing him the luxury of putting all the time that he needed to put in to develop, his theories. So again, puts her in more of a supportive role. So the current consensus of historians is that she was not a collaborator of the theories of relativity by any reasonable definition. At best, she was a sounding board. But she does this extensive communication back and forth. There's absolutely at no point does she say, "Hey, what do you think about this?" Like she's not introducing any or proposing any ideas or any solutions or anything to the process. Just listening to Einstein pitch them to her.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's like it's how do you define?
What
collaboration is? But collaboration is being a sounding board.
So the myth, not scientifically though, but the myth is that she was like significantly authoring the theory of relativity and was being uncredited for
like it was
genuine scientific work.
Like they were her ideas.
It should have been
co-authoring.
Exactly. She should have been like
and Watson kind of slight, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. She was at the co-author level and was uncredited, not just that she was, chatting with him about it or whatever.
Yeah.
So, I discuss my book with my wife, but she's not going to be credited as an author on the cover because she's, we're just chatting about it. She's not collaborating in any meaningful way. It's the same kind of thing. So I guess I swept you guys this week.
You can't say good job to anyone this week.
I'm so mad at myself. I'm going to drill into my head now. Kara, think about the question you're answering.
Right.
I basically said, well, but also then I would have been stuck between Evan and Alexander Fleming because I disagreed with the first one too.
Yeah.
The one I agreed with as science is the one I picked.
The one you were most confident about is the one you accidentally picked.
Yeah, sometimes I go back and I read it again. I'm like, wait, how did I miss that absolutely critical word that's right in the middle there?
This isn't even that boneheaded. This is I sometimes forget that in science or fiction, there are 2 real, 1 fictitious, and it's our job to pick the fiction, not to pick the science.
Okay, Evan, give us a quote.
Well, speaking of Nobel Prizes, I believe scientists have a duty to share the excitement and pleasure of their work with the general public, and I enjoy the challenge of presenting difficult ideas in an understandable way. Anthony Hewish, who's a British radio astronomer who won the Nobel Prize for Physics co-winner in 1974 for his role in the discovery of pulsars.
So pulsar is kind of important to astronomy.
Cool. Yes.
Yeah.
Little green men.
Right, LGMs.
I forgot to look up, actually, let's see when he said that. It was apparently 1975 is when he said this. So that's, before the modern science communication era, certainly, and before, we talk about it all the time, the importance of it, with the scientists sharing their work directly with the public. So this was at a time, when that was just kind of maybe emerging as a phenomenon.
Yeah. I think it's still emerging. I think it's still a work in progress, in terms of academia fully appreciating the need to fully engage with the public on whatever their academic interest is.
Definitely.
I think the social media has really brought to the fore how critical it is. Because if we don't do it, who do you think is going to do it? Right? It's going to just be all entertainment and con artists.
Ugh, God.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Well, thank you all for joining me this week.
Sure, man.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Steve.
And until next week, this is your Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. Skeptic's Guide to the Universe is produced by SGU Productions, dedicated to promoting science and critical thinking. For more information, visit us at theskepticsguide.org. Send your questions to info@theskepticsguide.org. And if you would like to support the show and all the work that we do, go to patreon.com/skepticsguide and consider becoming a patron and becoming part of the SGU community. Our listeners and supporters are what make SGU possible.